This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Institute, promoting humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin. Gilad isn't here today, but he'll be back soon. Every week we talk about books and research and other things that we think are interesting and fascinating. And of course, you can always support us by going to tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review and clicking on the Patreon button to support us, or going to patreon.com/Tel Aviv Review. Every little bit goes a long way. Our guest today is Liza Rozovsky. She is an Israeli journalist with a special beat: contemporary Russian culture, Russian and former Soviet immigrants in Israel, immigrant issues in general, and most recently she's covering social and cultural trends as well as broad political issues in Germany, where she now lives. Liza immigrated to Israel from the former Soviet Union and has worked for Russian-language TV and other media outlets in Israel, including the independent Hebrew website Hottest Place in Hell, and for the last 5 years with Haaretz newspaper, where some of her work, including the remarkable feature pieces we'll be talking about today, are translated into English as well. We'll be talking mainly about these articles that I like to call the dark side of Russian counterculture, although it's not always dark, and the cultural world of Soviet immigrants to Israel as well. Liza Rozovsky, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let's start with your work on contemporary Russian cultural figures. Many of your articles, I find, focus on a specific person in contemporary culture: playwright, children's author, theater director, documentary theater troops, just to name a few. What are you looking for? What interests you when you choose these subjects? And do you think that there is any common thread between them?
I think there are lots of things in common between modern Israel and modern Russia.
That is a big statement right off the bat. Tell me what you mean.
I know. It's a very controversial one, too, because most of the Israelis, or many of the Israelis, including the Russian Israelis I know, don't like to be compared to Russia. And they are right, in a way, because, Russia is a huge country with a very long history, with, among other things, long history of tyranny. And, of course, modern Israel is very different. At the same time, in terms of the leadership and in terms of certain, I would say, spiritual tendencies, they are things alike. For example, the feeling of chosen people, a people that hold some very special idea that they should bring to the rest of the world, is common to Russians and Jews in general, and in a way to modern Israel and to modern Russia.
But that's interesting because the Jewish people feel that way based on their religion. They say our religion tells us we are the chosen people, whereas you're talking about Russia as a nation. But they still have a sense of chosenness on some level?
Well, first of all, the Pravoslavian Christianity, the way it was perceived by intellectuals in the 19th century and in 20th century as well. I wouldn't say I don't know enough about it, but I think lots of intellectuals, including people like Dostoevsky, of course, and Rozanov, they felt that there is a specific Russian idea which is connected to the religion and to some, mysterious things as well. And now, because there is a long history of opposition between Russia and the West, and a feeling of certain Russian intellectuals and certain Russian governors, rulers, that they need to bring this idea, this power, this counter something to the West. Now, you're right that I think it's kind of complicated to capture what is it exactly. What is this idea?
What is this great gospel that each side has to bring to the world?
Exactly. But it's still there. And of course, Vladimir Putin is very much a big protagonist of this view. So I think as an Israeli and as an Israeli Russian, it's very fascinating to watch what's going on in Russia. The opposition there, or this eternal opposition between the Westerns and the ones who hold to the ground, to the Russian soil, And so I think...
So you're looking at a clash of cultures in a way, or tension between cultures.
Yes, and again, I think I'll give you an example. When I wrote about this documentary theater that is... they do their job in a very, very complicated political environment. They are attacked by different groups, not the mainstream, but different right radicals, for example, who are silently supported by the regime in a way when they're against them. And of course, they have lots of logistic problems. For example, they rent a certain stage, and then the stage says, "Oh, I'm sorry, we can't rent you the place."
Somehow coincidentally, it's not working.
Yeah. So of course, it's it rings lots of bells. It is a lot it's similar in a lots of ways to the things that are going on with independent theaters or with theaters that have sort of a leftist
critical
perspective.
Well, I mean, this is you really preempted one of my questions. I mean, I was going to ask you about actually a theater director that you've interviewed, Kirill Srebrennikov, if I'm saying it correctly.
Yeah, I didn't really interview him. He just gave me a written comment. Sadly,
well, he's in a very sensitive situation himself, right? Because he has been both close to the authorities, supported by the government, but then also somehow got on the bad side of the government and has been detained and has tried to direct his plays through his lawyer from prison.
And he succeeded, actually.
And he succeeded. And I think that the question that arises from what you're saying is, to what extent was he tolerated by the political forces? And then why did they turn on him? How did he find himself in this kind of middle ground with his social, commentary?
When we talk about modern Russia, we need to understand a few things. First of all, there is a very wide class of people who live a very comfortable life. And they do very interesting intellectual things, among others. And, theaters and music and art is actually flourishing. It's still flourishing. It keeps flourishing. But at the same time, they are all under constant pressure. And this pressure becomes harder and harder all the time. Those people are the ones who supported Yeltsin against President Boris Yeltsin, against the Communist Party. And some of them participated in his campaign in the middle of the 90s and actually brought him to power, although the citizens, most of the citizens, were against him.
Were against Yeltsin.
Yes, because the economical situation was very hard. But this, very relatively small group of intelligentsia was pro-Yeltsin because they thought that freedom is more important than bread. And of course, they had bread anyway, unlike the people in the periphery and the working class. And then they helped Yeltsin, some of them helped Yeltsin to bring Putin to power because they thought that he's going to pursue this line. And he didn't. And they understood that they were actually doing some pretty anti-democratic stuff back in the 90s and anti-people stuff, and they turned against him. But it was too late because he gained power and this ring is closing around them. So I think in a way Srebrennikov and many others belong to this same elite.
So people who supported essentially Yeltsin and then Putin because they thought they would advance a certain freedom that would eventually also benefit the country economically, but then found themselves under the rule of these rather anti-democratic and anti-freedom leaders.
Yeah, I think they mostly thought that they are not going to let Russia go back to the communism and that they are not going to do some bad things to oppress the oligarchs who actually, some of them, became patrons of culture, of TV, of free television, of very, very good journalism and documentary and anything, you name it. So, yes, and then they understood that they were wrong.
And then apparently the regime also understood that they were not so friendly.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. So it's, yeah.
So what are the authorities attacking someone like Srebrennikov for? Why did they detain him?
We don't really know. It might be just like, a show of power. he might have been picked pretty randomly, because, he is being charged of fraud, and not really fraud.
I think you wrote propaganda and promoting homosexuality and pedophilia, which are kind of generic.
No, wait. That's something else. That's Sorokin we're talking about.
Oh gosh, but totally right. Okay,
but those are not real charges. No. He is being charged of basically wasting state money that was given to the theater on some other purposes. They have proven that he did it. Mm-hmm. All the money that was given to him was invested in theater, but there might have been some, things that were not done by the book, because nobody does things by the book in Russia. But then, as it was like, for example, with Yukos, right, when they arrested Khodorkovsky, they found all kinds of wrong things, but then again, everybody did them. Why did they pick him? With Serebrennikov, it's of course even more unjust because, okay, again, he got some money for theater and he invested them in theater and in plays. But still, there might be some formal reasons to charge him. I don't know why is it being done. Probably after all the international pressure and et cetera, they're going to let him go eventually. But, the ones who need to understand the clue understood the clue, basically.
So, you yourself raised the comparison to Israel. Reading this story, I couldn't help think about how there are various forms of cultural intimidation here in Israel, and they don't take the form usually of having people arrested.
Exactly.
But they do take the form of intimidation. Pulling state funding, making comments, and trying to kind of run a campaign and, slander the intentions of cultural figures. We don't have to name names, but Culture Minister Miri Regev, if we were to name names, she might come up. Did you have these examples in mind when you see these things happening in Russia?
Well, yeah. Again, in Israel, it's much less grave. When we're talking about Israel, then of course probably the only sphere in which Israel is leading on Russia in a bad way is occupation. We did it before them. I mean, they're
did catching up in Ukraine.
Yeah. So of course it's much less grave, all the things that are going on in Israel, and I think that the Israeli democracy is stronger and the culture of obedience is much weaker in Israel. In Russia, you need just to wink and people will understand the clue. Here, it doesn't work like this. So I really hope we're not going in the same direction. But again, the style of leadership, the finding of the inner and the outer enemies, and the pointing, all this is common.
But one of the things you raised about Russia being a country that's lived under tyrannical regimes for much of its history, certainly much of its modern history, makes me wonder about what does this mean for the cultural scene? You said there is a flourishing cultural scene in Russia now. On the other hand, I remember when I spoke with Masha Gessen, she writes in her book about how this sociology and the sort of the social sciences fields of study under communism were suppressed to the point where people didn't even have a language to inspect their own society. That made a huge impression on me. And I wonder if living under tyrannical regimes suppresses great cultural expression or
vice versa.
Maybe the opposite. Maybe it gives rise to people feeling absolute need to really express themselves. And that's why Russia is such a great contribution to the cultural scene.
Okay, so again, I think we need to mention the intelligentsia, this relatively small, narrow group of elite, as a group which all along Russian history had very interesting and special relationships with the government, with the rulers. So I think, from the times of Pushkin and his complicated relationship with Tsar Alexander, and to the times of Stalin and his complicated dialogues with all kinds of intellectuals, including Pasternak, we have this relationship. So this elite group, in different times it lives differently. But in general, it's a privileged group. It's a very important to understand that with all the oppression and repression and whatever and the gulags, it's still a privileged group who gets their dachas outside of Moscow, who gets relatively lots of free time to create, to think. But at the same time, they need to do whatever they do in those boundaries of the censorship and of the ideological line that the rulers draw. So I think as soul-searching, well, it's done from time to time, but it's constantly needed for this group. Right. So again, if we take, for example, Alexandra Brustein.
I was just going to ask you about her, because she's a good example of this, right? I mean, their whole article about her, and we'll talk about who she is about how she kind of is somewhere in between being close to the ideals of, socialism and what the Soviet Union was supposed to be, but kind of became the subversive critical figure anyway, even though she didn't necessarily intend to be. So explain who she is maybe for us.
Okay, so Alexandra Brustein was a writer and mostly a playwright, Soviet playwright, who was a little bit forgotten except for this book I wrote about called The Road Goes Into the Distance.
A trilogy. It's actually part of a trilogy.
Yes, right? Yes. And she was totally a part of the regime ideology. She was born in Vilna, which is now Lithuania, to a Jewish intellectual family.
In the late 19th century. Right?
Yeah. She was in all kinds of ways part of the revolutionary movement. Then after the revolution, she became an important part of the establishment. And she kept believing in communism ideals, I think, until her last day. Although, of course, again, in her milieu, everybody knew what's going on. So, for instance, when a leading female writer wrote to her about her Gulag experiences, or she wrote a book, actually, about her Gulag experiences. So she wrote her, the people who tortured you are not real communists. So she knew what's going on. She just...
Who was that female writer who was in the Gulag?
I forgot her name right now. Yeah. She's also Jewish, of course. Or, I don't know, one of her best friends, Frida Vigdorova, is a journalist and a writer who's... One of the things she will be remembered for is that the fact that she wrote, stenographed, or the trial of Brodsky, of the poet Joseph Brodsky. So again, the whole environment was very much... They all read the books that were not published, that were samizdat. They all knew a lot, and they still were participating. And, for example, there is one guy, Dmitry Bykov, who I'm interviewing for this article about Brustein. He's very, very influential right now. He's everywhere. He's a very good speaker, a good writer, and he gives lots of lectures, popular lectures on Russian culture and mostly Russian literature. But one of his ideas is not only his, but he's one of the prominent people who represent those ideas, that the Soviet Union wasn't so bad. There were lots of good things in the Soviet Union. The education system, the health care system, the ideology of sharing, of friendship, real friendship, of sacrificing, of living for something bigger, not just for yourself.
I'm glad you mentioned him, because I also noticed what he said about her, which was quite interesting. He said she played the game, but without the rules. In your article. And I thought that's a fascinating way to characterize somebody in her situation who's close to the regime in one sense, but also writing stuff that isn't normally written about. So explain what he means by that.
Well, she was sincere. I think that's what he meant. Yeah, this book, we have to explain, of course, that this book is actually her memories about her childhood, about her family mostly and friends, and the revolutionary, I wouldn't say movements, but bubbling or whatever that was going on in the air in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's a book for children.
But you say it's also a book that can be read by adults.
Totally. But for me, when I read it when I was 9 or 8 years old, I discovered the world. For example, I first heard about the Dreyfus case from there. And when I asked all kinds of people I know, they said, yeah, me too. That's my only source. I never heard about Dreyfus case ever again.
So is one of her main contributions writing about Jewish history in a way that really wasn't even necessarily allowed in Soviet
No,
thinking
it wasn't
and
prohibited.
exactly. But also the way Jewish experiences were remembered followed a narrative line in the Soviet Union, and she didn't necessarily pay attention to that.
That's true. Yeah, of course. She introduced, in a way, again, I think she introduced me and lots of people I knew to our cultural ancestors or whatever, to intellectual secular Jews who lived in Russia before the revolution, who had all those... Okay, again, she's not mentioned in the book because it's not allowed, but her father was a prominent Zionist figure. So who were... having their hesitations between the Bund and the Zionism and just the Russian revolutionary movements, and they couldn't decide, and all this kind of thing. Again, when I was 8, I didn't understand it, of course, in depth, but I felt and they were speaking Yiddish and Russian and sometimes Polish and lots of other and French and German. So
I mean, one of the things I found interesting about your review of Burstein is that she seems to, on the one hand, bring to life the Jewish legacy in Russia from pre and post-revolution, also while saying a lot about life under the Soviet Union in general, but also somehow conveying a kind of universal theme about the struggles of identity and the many layers of people's identity. Or am I reading that into your analysis of her?
No, I mean, again, I think... On the one hand, she mentioned freely the Jewishness and stuff. And on the other hand, she kind of, she didn't want the Russian readers to think, okay, there were only Jews in pre-revolutionary Vilna. So, for example, she gave Russian names to certain figures who actually were Jews. And there is a feeling of cosmopolitanism, whatever, in pre-revolutionary Vilna of Russians and Poles and Jews and some Lithuanians living together.
And this is happening at a time when the term cosmopolitan is, like a death sentence.
Yes, that's true. I mean, and it's important, again, to mention that she was a prominent playwright, so some of her best friends were damaged by this Stalin campaign against the cosmopolitanism. There are lots of paradoxes in Soviet Union.
Right. I want to ask about your experience bringing this kind of stuff to the Israeli audience. And this will get us into one final article that I definitely want to talk about. But how much do Israelis, your average Israeli reader, even those who consider themselves liberal intellectuals and read Haaretz, do they take an interest in contemporary or historic Russian culture? I mean, after bringing over 1 million former Soviets here,
it's hard for me to say. I think, writing this and, some social activity I was into before I actually started working in Haaretz is part of, it's not necessarily, the audience who reads it, I think, are actually lots of young and not so young Russian the immigrants, of children of Russian-speaking immigrants who are finally seeing themselves on the pages of an Israeli newspaper, so they couldn't read about themselves. So of course I want the Israeli readers to read those articles, but maybe even more important for me is that, people of my age and younger, who some of them forgot Russian, some of them still speak Russian, but not so much, suddenly, they see their legacy inside of the Israeli discourse.
Yeah, because I think, like so many immigrant groups, they're used to seeing themselves in a stereotyped fashion, whether it's positive or negative, in Israeli kind of popular imagination. They're either the unemployed musician working in sweeping floors, or, some of these stereotypes. Or I think the other way we encounter the former Soviet population in Israel is when politicians are pandering for their votes.
Yeah,
and I just think that it's a little unusual in Israeli society to see Russian culture be the center of, expressing this community. So I guess I'm curious if you think that, or first of all, is that a mission of yours, or you just write about it because you like it and hope that other people like it too?
It's just me, and it's just me. And I guess that's just the stuff I care about. And I know that there are lots of other people who care about the same stuff. So I'm glad to, bring it to them and do the others.
Right. Let's talk about another article that I've read years ago, but I really love about the painter Zoya Cherkassky.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason I love it is because it encapsulates a lot of what we just mentioned. The experience of, over 1 million people who came following 1990, roughly, and, the obstacles to integration. And she painted all of this. How did she paint all of that into a series of paintings, and why was it so controversial?
Well, first of all, she's good.
She is really good, in my opinion, but that's just my opinion.
She has a touch for satire, right? Not only for drawing, but for, noticing those social trends and conflicts. The article I wrote about her was actually about her Syria's Soviet childhood. It was not about the Israeli Aliyah series.
But I know that you know about both of them, so you can tell us about both of them.
Yes. But it's important because, I think in a way her series about Soviet childhood is not less controversial than her...
Oh, you convinced me in the article completely.
because her thesis in a way, or no, it's not a thesis, but it's something that you kind of capture or get when you see those paintings are, okay, not everything about the Soviet Union was bad. There is a true nostalgia you can feel towards it. Again, she admits, and of course we all understand that it's a child perspective, a privileged child perspective, because again, Zoya was part of this same elite, and her family and my family, and lots of Russian-speaking Israelis were part of this intelligentsia, and we don't have a really objective view on what's going.
And a child never has an objective view. That's okay.
Yeah.
But it's true that out of those paintings, let's jump to the series about a life in her childhood in the former Soviet Union, and then we can get back to the series about moving to Israel. They are so nostalgic that even someone like me who has no connection to the former Soviet Union feels the warmth and comfort, and beauty of those photos. But they also have little bits and pieces of subversive critique in them.
Totally. Yeah, they show people being raped and beaten up in the, in the yard. And then the second painting of the same diptych shows the same going on in an Israeli average low-class neighborhood. So, yes, she's all about it. Again, why was the Aliyah series so controversial? Because, for the Russians, because I think the feeling of belonging and the feeling of success and the feeling of, we did it, we overcame, is very important to a very big part of the Russian-speaking community in Israel. And when they're shown their own experience kind of mocked in a way, it hurts.
In what ways did she mock the experience, do you think?
Oh, I don't know. For example, the painting where you see the mashgiach kashrut.
Yeah, a kashrut supervisor.
Kashrut supervisor, yeah, paying a visit to a new immigrant family and opens the fridge and sees the pig's
pig snout.
Yeah, coming out of a bowl, whatever, or the painting which shows the circumcision of a grown-up man, or of course, those paintings where you see a naked woman in a provocative sort of prostitute pose, and the name of the picture is something like the Aliyah of the 90s. Some of the Russian-speaking Israelis feel that this kind of pictures, they increase or whatever the stereotypes that exist already in the Israeli society about them. Which what I think they don't understand, of course, is that Zoya is playing with those stereotypes and laughing about them and laughing about everybody else.
And didn't she also develop that series based on interviews that she did with people?
I think she started this series in on a blog platform when she asked people to send her their stories.
Right. So it wasn't just, this is how I experience.
Yeah.
This is what I'm representing other
Yeah,
people.
yeah. Totally.
And how did she manage in that series not only to upset one marginal group, recent immigrants, but another marginalized group of the Mizrahim?
Well, let's put Zoya aside because I don't know. It's hard for me to explain what did she want to say. But
Sure,
I can
sure.
say...
How do you see it?
Well, as many other Russian immigrants, when I came to Israel as a child, we came to a neighborhood which was inhabited mostly by Mizrahim. I didn't know that back then because we didn't know those terms, but that was the fact. And the encounter between Russian new immigrants and the Mizrahi society was hostile. It wasn't simple. Like, I don't know, I had very difficult experiences in school, like most of my friends did. Now, you can, see it in lots of ways. You can see, okay, we are all victims of the Ashkenazi establishment. And then you can say, okay, maybe we're all victims of Ashkenazi establishment, but it's a little bit too far-fetched for me. So I cannot just, put it on them. I'm still angry with the kids that, told me you're stinky Russian, whatever, And I think when Zoya draws this picture of a falafel owner who harasses a Russian employee, yeah. Oh, yes, you can say it's, a complicated statement about stereotypes, and you can say, okay, it was the actual experience of lots of people and lots of women. There is another diptych of a Russian Jewish boy being beaten and, peed on by some Ukrainian hooligans, and then the same Jewish boy with violin and stuff like this being mocked by obviously Mizrahi-looking Israeli boys and girls. And again, it was a genuine experience of lots of people. That's it. I don't think I want or can say anything more than that.
Well, I think what comes out of, to my mind, and this is what I was really, thinking about when I read the different articles that you've written, is that I think what many of your subjects have in common is a sense of strangeness and newness and alienation and the kind of disruption of being an immigrant. But in some ways, I feel like that sense of strangeness can be shared by many people in the world. And you now have gone through it twice because you moved to Israel and then now you moved to Germany. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like this sense of otherness somehow characterizes your experiences, and do you bring that with you to your writing and your choice of subjects?
Yes. Yes. I would say that only when I moved to Germany, I realized how that Israel actually became my home. And that I'm actually much more in the Israeli or Russian Israeli than anything else. And how important are certain things in Israel and the feeling of community that I've built here through the years. Although for, many years I felt that, I don't think it's only me, again, I think it's lots of people my age that feel that, okay, Israel is some kind of temporary home, and then we will move forward. We don't know where, but there must be some better life somewhere else. Again, only when I moved to Germany because my husband does his postdoctoral studies there, I realized that actually maybe I did lose a home that I've built here.
So it seems like maybe it just takes continuing to move and change our surroundings in order to actually realize when we're home. I like that as an ending point. I don't know if you meant that to be your big grand statement, but
it's actually pretty close.
But the experience of being an outsider and looking in and being critical and sometimes being subversive and countercultural, I think is common to a lot of your work. And I think there is something universal about that.
Well, I hope.
Thank you. That's Liza Rozovsky, journalist with Haaretz, covering contemporary and historic Russian culture, social and political trends in Russia, Israel, Germany. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Georgia Foscarini and Itai Shelem, our producers. and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing a review. Just go to the ratings and review section and then write one. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive with almost 500 interviews. If you like us, you can like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel, and follow us on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.